What happens when a leader's obsession turns into a global headache? When ambition isn't just big, it's reckless. Today, we're looking at a story that has shaken alliances and sent shockwaves across the world. Donald Trump's fascination with land, his relentless push to expand influence through territorial deals, has just exploded in his face. What started as a bold vision has spiraled into diplomatic chaos, leaving America's closest allies questioning everything they thought they knew about U.S. leadership. This isn't just about one failed move. It's about the ripple effect on trust, power, and the very fabric of global partnerships. Will this gamble cost the U.S. its most critical allies? Or is this just another political storm that will pass? Let's break it down. When we talk about Trump's land obsession, it's tempting to dismiss it as a quirk, a fixation that fits the image of a real estate mogul turned politician. But this isn't just about personal preference, it's about power, perception, and the psychology of control. Trump has long equated land with leverage and leverage with dominance. In his world, owning something tangible is the ultimate assertion of authority. But the world stage does not operate like a real estate boardroom. Nations aren't properties to be bought, sold, or reshaped at will. They are sovereign entities bound by history, pride, and identity. And when you attempt to reduce that to a transactional deal, the backlash is inevitable. That backlash is what we are witnessing now. America's closest allies are looking at these moves not as bold strategy, but as reckless ambition. What started as talk of acquisition, whether it was floating the idea of buying Greenland or hinting at territorial influence in sensitive regions, has now created a narrative of unpredictability. And in geopolitics, unpredictability is not strength, it is instability. Allies thrive on trust, on the quiet confidence that partnerships will be guided by shared values, not sudden whims. When that confidence erodes, even the strongest alliances begin to tremble. There is a deeper psychological dynamic at play here. The concept of land is tied to permanence. To own land is to own security, to root oneself in certainty. But what happens when that pursuit of certainty for one nation generates uncertainty for all others? It creates a paradox. The very quest for dominance breeds vulnerability. Because the moment allies feel that their own sovereignty could be treated as a bargaining chip, they start questioning the entire relationship. And once doubt enters the equation, trust is no longer a given. It becomes a negotiation in itself. This is why Trump's land obsession is more than a headline, it's a warning sign. It reveals a world view that places transactional gain above relational stability. And in a global order already strained by competing powers and fragile agreements, that kind of approach doesn't just disrupt deals. It disrupts the architecture of cooperation that holds the system together. So the question isn't whether the U.S. can pursue bold ideas, it's whether it can do so without alienating the very partners who make its influence sustainable. Because power without partnership is an illusion. It looks strong in the short term, but it collapses under the weight of isolation. And that is the truth we must confront. In chasing land, Trump may have risked something far greater, the ground of trust upon which America's leadership truly stands. When allies begin to question reliability, it's not a surface-level concern, it's an existential one. Trust between nations is not built on paper, it's built on patterns, on the predictability that comes from shared values and mutual respect. For decades, U.S. alliances were anchored in that trust. They weren't perfect, but they were steady. Now, that steadiness feels fractured. Every sudden move, every headline that suggests unilateral decision-making plants seeds of doubt. And doubt, once sown, does not grow into loyalty. It grows into distance. Imagine being a leader in Europe or Asia watching this play out. You've invested in decades of partnership under the assumption that America's word is as solid as its power. Then you see policies and statements that seem to shift without warning, strategies that favor spectacle over stability. What do? you start looking for alternatives. You start asking whether the old order still serves your interests, or whether it's time to diversify your security, your trade, your diplomatic bets. That is not an overnight decision, but it is a dangerous drift, and here's where psychology enters the equation. In relationships, whether personal or political, the greatest fear is abandonment, and the greatest cause of abandonment is neglect. When allies feel neglected or taken for granted, they begin preparing for life without you. They won't say it outright, but they'll test other options, build new bridges, and hedge against your unpredictability. This is exactly what we're seeing now. Quiet conversations between allies and rival powers, whispers of alignment that would have seemed unthinkable a decade ago. The irony is striking. Trump's approach was meant to project strength, to signal that America would no longer be taken advantage of. But in doing so, he may have achieved the opposite, making allies feel like liabilities instead of partners, assets instead of equals. And when that happens, the foundation of alliance shifts from cooperation to calculation. Every commitment is now weighed against the risk of betrayal. Every handshake becomes a strategy rather than a bond. This is more than a diplomatic inconvenience. It's a strategic vulnerability. Because the United States doesn't just rely on its military might. It relies on a network of nations willing to stand together when it matters most. If that network frays, no amount of hard power can compensate for the loss of soft trust. So here is the reality we can't ignore. When reliability is questioned, influence is diminished. The U.S. cannot lead the world if the world no longer feels led. It feels managed, negotiated with, or worse, abandoned. And that is a cost no great power can afford to pay. When alliances falter, power doesn't simply vanish, it shifts. It flows toward those who can offer what the old order no longer guarantees: stability, respect, and predictability. That's the law of geopolitics. There is no vacuum. There is only replacement. And right now, as traditional allies look at Washington and question its constancy, other players are moving to fill the space. Nations like China, Russia, and emerging regional powers are not waiting on the sidelines. They are extending their hands, offering partnerships framed not as charity but as necessity. Think about what this means in practical terms. When Europe doubts America's reliability, who steps in with energy deals and infrastructure investments? When Asian partners sense a gap in long-term strategy, who offers alternative security guarantees or economic incentives? These shifts don't happen overnight, but they begin as whispers, as quiet negotiations, as memorandums that eventually harden into treaties. By the time the headlines catch up, the realignment has already taken root, and here's the deeper psychological truth. Alliances are emotional as much as they are strategic. They are built on the sense that we are in this together. When that feeling erodes, it creates a hunger for belonging somewhere else. If a partner no longer feels valued, they seek validation elsewhere, and in geopolitics, validation often comes with strings attached. That is the danger. When America's allies start looking beyond Washington for reassurance, they inevitably find it in places that do not share the same democratic values, the same vision of order. That, more than any single policy, changes the world's balance of power. We need to understand the stakes here. This isn't about losing a trade deal or a defense contract. It's about losing influence, the quiet, intangible force that makes nations follow your lead even when it's difficult. Influence is not enforced, it's earned. And when it slips, regaining it is far harder than maintaining it. Once trust fractures and alternatives are built, the clock cannot simply be turned back. This is why the obsession with short-term wins, with symbolic victories over partners, carries such a devastating long-term cost. Because every time an ally feels humiliated, every time they feel secondary instead of equal, the architecture of cooperation weakens, and in that weakness, others step in to build a different design, one where America is no longer the central pillar. So let's be clear. The question is not whether the U.S. remains powerful today. It does. The question is whether it remains trusted tomorrow. And without trust, power becomes an empty throne, impressive in appearance but hollow in substance. That is the reality this moment forces us to confront. When we speak of isolation, it's easy to imagine it as a distant, abstract concept. A shift in diplomatic circles, a reshuffling of alliances that only policymakers notice. But isolation has weight. It carries economic consequences that ripple through industries, markets, and households. It carries security implications that alter military strategies and global stability. And most of all, it carries a psychological cost, the erosion of confidence in a nation's role as a reliable pillar of leadership. Every alliance that fractures, every partner that walks away, creates an opening for someone else to step in. But it also creates something more dangerous: doubt in the value of alignment with the United States. That doubt can turn into hesitation, hesitation into distance, and distance into disengagement. The U.S. has long thrived not simply because of its military might or economic muscle, but because of its ability to rally others, to build coalitions, to project unity, to stand not as one nation alone, but as the leader of many. Strip that away, and what remains is power without partnership, a brittle power prone to shattering under pressure. And here lies the paradox. A strategy meant to assert strength can become the very thing that exposes weakness. Economic retaliation is one example. If allies begin to disengage, trade flows contract. Markets react not just to what is, but to what they fear will come. That fear is already visible in shifting supply chains, in negotiations with alternate powers, in the quiet recalibration of global investment strategies. Isolation does not happen with a dramatic exit. It creeps in through 1,000 subtle decisions, each one moving the world a little further away from American influence. Then comes the military dimension. The U.S. may still command vast resources, but resources alone do not win modern conflicts. Networks do: intelligence sharing, logistical support, bases across continents. All of these depend on alliances. If those relationships weaken, so does deterrence. And history has shown us what happens when deterrence fails. Chaos steps in to take its place. Ultimately, the question we must ask is simple. Can a nation afford to alienate the very allies who amplify its voice on the world stage? Can it bear the cost of going it alone in a world where interdependence is not a choice, but a condition of survival? The honest answer is no, because the truth is this: isolation isn't strength, it's silence, and silence in a world this loud is the first step toward irrelevance.